Hi, and welcome back. And today is the sixth and unfortunately the last session in our series of films of and
Mm.
about the 60s. We've now gone from films from the 60s to films looking back at the 60s. Coming Home was released in 1978, and it offers us a retrospective from 10 years onward on the terrible impact that the Vietnam War was causing in the US by 1968. It was always Jane Fonda's project, stemming from her friendship with the terribly wounded paraplegic anti war veteran Ron Kovic. I want to underline, which I've already said because I couldn't stop before, I want to underline that the film has compassion for all three of its main characters, not just for the countercultural figures played by John Voight and Jane Fonda, but also for the stern Marine officer, Jane Fonda's husband in the film, played by Bruce Dern. In this sense, it reflects a cultural perspective at 10 years' distance. Originally, the Marine officer was written as a monster, but Jane Fonda helped prevent it. One of the themes in our course has been that making a movie is very difficult. Money pressures, time pressures, complicated
Uh-huh.
organizing pressures, the turbulent interaction of very creative but driven and flawed human beings. In the case of Coming Home, it took 5 years of struggle to bring Jane Fonda's original vision to the screen. Conflicts and illness led to major withdrawals from the project, one director and two screenwriters. Yet the final product was hugely popular. US box office receipts returned 5 times the original investment by United Artists, and the picture won multiple awards, including Academy Awards in 1979 for Best Actress, Fonda, Best Actor, John Voight, Best Screenplay, Waldo Salt, plus Academy nominations for Best Picture, Best Supporting Actor, Bruce Dern, Best Supporting Actress, Penelope Milford, and Best Director, Hal Ashby. This is a huge haul of awards, very unusual in highly competitive Hollywood, and that the Hollywood community gave so many awards to an anti war movie carried a powerful political meaning as well. I want to begin talking about the film after that introduction by talking about the military draft as a general background to the character of paraplegic veteran Luke Martin. In the 50s and 60s, conscription was a fact of life for every teenage American male. As a young man's 18th birthday approached, so did draft registration, the draft physical, and likely eventual induction into the armed forces. But male students who went to college got a 4 year deferral. The government did this because they believed that encouraging higher education was good for the country in general. I myself, at one point, had a National Defense Education Act fellowship to study Mediterranean history. I think that's pretty amazing that that happened. But when Lyndon Johnson committed US ground forces to Vietnam in 1965, draft calls soared from 100,000 men in 1964 to 400,000 in 1966, just 2 years later. For most young people, this forged an indissoluble link between the draft and Vietnam. In spite of the fact that draftees made up only a minority of all military personnel, they made up the vast bulk of the infantry riflemen in Vietnam. 88% were draftees. And they made up almost half the battlefield deaths. Draftees were real cannon fodder. In the youth movie Wild in the Streets, 1968, which I've mentioned before, the bitter teenage presidential candidate tells his cheering audience, they won't draft us, we'll draft them. Uh, Not by accident, the most revolutionary of the Jefferson Airplane music albums was entitled, I don't know whether you can see this, Volunteers. That is, those who joined the anti-war movement were not drafted into it. They were volunteers. Coming Home is also specifically based on resistance to Vietnam among the armed forces themselves. This isn't well known. But by 1969, there developed a resistance culture among grunts in Vietnam, expressed in afros, rock and soul music, the wearing of beads, peace symbols on helmets, clenched fists, and eventually hundreds of fragging incidents. That is, overeager officers suddenly getting grenaded in their tents. Also, there were Navy enlistees sabotaging of aircraft carriers bound for Vietnam. In autumn 1972, very serious internal sabotaging of aircraft carriers, the widely beloved icons of American power, happened 3 separate times to 3 separate major aircraft carriers. By 1970 in the US, there also developed what was called the GI coffee house movement, which set up cafes just outside military bases where disgruntled GIs could meet, discuss the war, and organize resistance. Jane Fonda was a central figure in the GI coffee house movement. Some of these GI coffee houses outside military bases were firebombed and destroyed by persons unknown. The local cops didn't seem interested in investigating. An example was the GI Coffee House outside of Fort Dix, New Jersey, the largest Army base in the Northeast, destroyed in late February 1970. For those of you who know weather underground history, that was why the people in the Townhouse Collective planned to firebomb Fort Dix in response to that, except they blew themselves up. So our film Coming Home is set a little bit earlier in 1968. What I'm saying is the general background was what's not well known was resistance to the war within the armed forces itself. In Coming Home, the embittered paraplegic Luke Martin, John Voight, engages increasingly in demonstrations aimed at undermining the draft system. His attitude reflects the start of the growth of the anti-war movement among the GIs themselves. Again, that was well known to people like Jane Fonda in 1978. It's disappeared mostly from history now, but that's the specific background to the film. So let's do the plot. I always like to lay out the basic narrative so we're all on the same page when talking about the meaning of important scenes. So in Southern California in 1968, Sally Hyde, that is Jane Fonda, a conservative military wife, is married to Bob Hyde, Bruce Dern, a dedicated USMC officer. Bob Hyde is about to be deployed with the Marines to Vietnam. At first, Sally dreads being left alone, but then she feels liberated by Bob's absence. Forced to find housing away from the base, she moves into a new apartment by the beach and buys a sports car. With nothing else to do, Sally volunteers at a local Veterans Administration hospital. It's there that she meets Luke Martin, John Voight. Actually, they had been in high school together, he as the handsome and physically domineering captain of the football team, she as a cheerleader. But Luke went to Vietnam and was terribly wounded, leaving him a paraplegic with no strength from the waist down. He is always in pain, filled with anger, and bitter at the careless medical treatment at the VA hospital. Luke is increasingly thrown into contact with Sally, and they develop a close relationship. Eventually, Luke is released from the hospital and, mobile in his wheelchair, begins to rebuild his life. Sally, for her part, is transformed by him, and her outlook on life becomes more and more openly and increasingly liberated. They have happy times, play at the beach, and fall in love. But Luke, bitter at the war, then chains himself to the gates of a local recruitment center in a vain attempt to stop others from enlisting. Sally and Luke eventually make love, with Sally experiencing her first orgasm through oral sex. But she doesn't want to divorce her husband, and Luke and Sally both know that their relationship will end when Bob returns home. And Bob does return home, and too soon, claiming he'd accidentally wounded himself in the leg. He's also suffering from what we would now call post traumatic stress disorder, stemming from the horrors he had seen in combat in Vietnam, including atrocities committed by his own Marines. Army intelligence had been spying on Luke ever since the gate incident, and they tell Bob about the affair between Sally and Luke. It's revenge on them because they're now opponents of the war. Sally and Luke privately agree to part because Sally still wants to preserve her marriage, but Bob confronts them with a loaded rifle. But he ultimately turns away. The final scene in the movie shows Luke speaking to young men about his terrible experience in Vietnam, intercut with a liberated Sally, and Bob placing his neatly folded Marine dress uniform on the beach, taking off his wedding ring, and swimming naked out into the ocean to commit suicide. So that's the plot. The film had a long and difficult pre-production, and I'm going to start talking about that. I was talking pre-production, production, post-production. The movie originated with Jane Fonda's vision in 1973, at a time when Hollywood wouldn't touch Vietnam for filmmaking. It then evolved via extensive research with disabled Vietnam veterans, and during the filming itself, it developed by improvisational work by the actors, improvisation up to and including on the final day of shooting. The material didn't come ready made, and they only had half a script when they began. In the early 1970s, Jane Fonda was, of course, a bitterly controversial figure. The daughter of the great star Henry Fonda and sister of Peter Fonda, whose Easy Rider we've seen, both children had experienced their mother's suicide and their father's offensively stoic reaction going on stage on Broadway that very night in the comedy Mr. Robert. Jane Fonda's own career in Hollywood began as a comic actor, which she's still excellent at, in everything from Tall Story, 1960, to Cat Ballou, 1965, to Barefoot in the Park, 1967, with Robert Redford, to Barbarella in 1968. But she'd been a public supporter of the civil rights movement, and then the Vietnam War had a big emotional impact on her. You can see the change in her acting. You can see the change to dramatic actor in the tragic film They Shoot Horses, Don't They, from 1969, an epic of long-term dancing and futility during the Depression. And it's a depressing movie. From 1970, she was also a leader in the GI coffee house movement, which I just talked about. Then in 1972, she visited Hanoi, where she was photographed at an anti-aircraft gun whose purpose was to shoot down American bombers. That occurred just after she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her portrayal of a disturbed prostitute in the Mystery Theater Klute. Her co-star in Klute was Donald Sutherland, another anti-war activist. In 1973, she married anti-war activist Tom Hayden. I told people, Judy and I know Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden's son, Troy. The result, especially of her visit to Hanoi, was that Fonda was gray listed by the film industry. She says producers were scared to use her. Even though she just won the Academy Award, she did not make a movie for 3 years and seriously considered leaving the film business entirely. but nagging at her was the idea of doing a film against the war. She formed an independent film company with fellow anti war activist Bruce Gilbert to make such a film. But what would this film be about? Fonda and Gilbert decided the project would be a home front story set in the States, not in Vietnam itself. There would be a focus on what manhood and patriotism really meant in 1968. The story would focus on the impact on three people: a paraplegic veteran, a classic Marine officer, and the officer's wife who had an affair with the paraplegic veteran while her husband is away in Vietnam. The paraplegic veteran was inspired directly by Jane Fonda's friend, Vietnam veteran Ron Kovic, the author of the bitter memoir Born on the 4th of July. It was Kovic who tried to disrupt a draft board, as Luke does in the film, and it was Kovic who gave talks to high schoolers, as we see Luke doing at the end of the film. The story would be about injured and embittered Luke Martin coming home to the morass of the VA hospitals, and about the Marine Corps wife's liberation from the narrow conventions by which she'd always lived. This was the first of a series of such characters that Jane Fonda would play, originally repressed and conventional women who are gradually liberated by experience. Other examples are Fonda's Judy Bernley in the comedy 9 to 5, 1980, and Harriet Winslow in 1989's drama The Old Gringo with Gregory Peck. I'm not saying this is bad, I'm just saying that Sally Hyde type characters became a Jane Fonda specialty. The first screenwriter hired by Fonda and Gilbert didn't work out. This was Nancy Dowd, a friend of Fonda's from the feminist movement. She resisted the idea of having a paraplegic as a key figure. Wouldn't audiences be repulsed? She wanted to focus mostly on the relationship between the two women, Sally Hyde and her friend Vi. But Fonda wanted the focus on the injured veterans. Dowd left after a year of work on the script, and her script was never used. Well, neither Fonda nor her partner Bruce Gilbert had ever produced a film before, and they now saw that they needed a professional, experienced producer. This sort of happened with Easy Rider too, when Dennis Hopper was really a novice director. But what happened after disaster in New Orleans was that he was provided with a professional crew. So to revive the project, which was now dead, they secured a crew of movie professionals. By happenstance, or maybe it was politics, the team they assembled were the people who'd made the Academy Award winning Midnight Cowboy back in 1969. Writer Waldo Salt, director John Schlesinger, producer Jerome Hellman. The strategy of the new team was that they themselves would pay for the research and for the development of a script, and then seek financing for a completed project by offering themselves to a studio as well-known and successful commodities in the movie business. And they would offer themselves for far less money than these people usually demanded. That was the level of commitment to the movie that eventually became Coming Home. The writer Waldo Salt spent $50,000 of his own money on research on paraplegic veterans and the scandalous of treatment at the Veterans Administration hospitals. Well, after they had taken that risk in 1976, United Artists became interested in really financing the movie. This was especially because the producer, Jerome Hellman, had had several successful projects for them, including Midnight Cowboy. But this was a financial and political risk for the studio. Other than John Wayne's pro-war potboiler, The Green Berets, from 1968, By 1976, no Hollywood studio had ever dared to make a film about the Vietnam War. The silence was deafening. Just think about that. The terrible war, the terrible destruction, Hollywood wouldn't touch it. Uh, but now they had the financing. Great. But at that point, the projected director, award winning British director John Schlesinger, withdrew from the project. He felt that the material could only be directed by an American. He said he felt like an interloper. So then they had to find a new director. Then in late 1976, with just a few weeks to go before filming began, the screenwriter Waldo Salt had a severe heart attack. The script was unfinished, and nobody could be found to finish it. As a replacement for director Schlesinger, Fonda, can you imagine? I mean, this is after 3-4 years of work on the project. As a replacement for director Schlesinger, Fonda and the producer Jerome Hellman chose Hal Ashby. Ashby was a soft-spoken countercultural director of Shampoo, which had been a big hit, The Last Detail, which had been a big hit, and Bound for Glory, a biography of radical folk singer Woody Guthrie, an idol you'll remember of Bob Dylan's. Ashby, given his politics, instantly agreed. Despite his hippie appearance, Ashby was a terrible workaholic. Perhaps that's why each of his 5 wives divorced him. Having just directed Shampoo, set in 1968, like Coming Home, Ashby was an expert on the ferocious clashes of culture and politics that marked that year. He'd already won an Academy Award for film editing for In the Heat of the Night, 1967, and he'd been one of the first Hollywood figures to smoke dope and take acid. Jon Voight, who plays the paraplegic Luke in the movie, was so impressed with Ashby as a person that he eventually pushed successfully to look like the real Ashby for the film, and he does. When you see Luke, you're actually looking at Jon Voight's impression of the director, Hal Ashby. In the summer and fall of 1976, having signed on, summer and fall of 76, Ashby assembled a huge archive of 1968 anti-war material to study. Shampoo had been a big, large box office success, but the film had really been under the total control of its star and producer, Warren Beatty. Ashby had not been allowed to put into the film all the music from 1968 that he'd wanted. Now, as he researched the war and its impact at home, the nature of the Veterans Administration hospitals, the nature of paraplegic disability, he played over and over the tapes of the great rock music from 1968 that Warren Beatty had excluded from Shampoo. Ashby found inspiration here, as Dennis Hopper had with Easy Rider in 1968 itself, if you remember. This was the music that eventually went into Coming Home. Not surprisingly, the VA refused to allow filming at their spinal cord facility in Long Beach, where many of the Vietnam wounded were shipped during the late 1960s. The VA's chief medical director labeled the script a tissue of lies, distortions, and misrepresentations. But Rancho Los Amigos, a private spinal cord facility in the city of Downey, made available 2 wings that were about to be renovated to use as sets for the film. In return, the film company helped fund the renovations. Much later, after they'd already finished shooting, Max Cleland, President Carter's newly appointed head of Veteran Affairs and a badly disabled Vietnam veteran himself, wrote to the producer Hellman offering full cooperation. Well, it was too late. The principal photography was done. So what had happened was that the Republican VA chief medical officer had been replaced by Max Cleland uh, as the head of Veteran Affairs, the Democrat under Jimmy Carter. Ashby and Hellman had originally offered John Voight the role of the gung-ho Marine captain, Bob Hyde. But Voight passionately coveted the role of Luke Martin, the paraplegic veteran, instead. This was because he was an anti-war activist himself, that is John Voight, and he'd become friendly with many Vietnam veterans while speaking out against the war. United Artists executives, however, wanted a big-name actor for the paraplegic protagonist. They offered it to Sylvester Stallone. Can you imagine? And then they offered it to Jack Nicholson, but he turned it down too because he said after One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1976, he said he was tired of filming in a hospital. So Hal Ashby decided to give John Voight a chance. The United Artists bureaucracy were horrified. They offered the project another $1 million of financing just to get a bigger star. But Hellman, the producer, and Ashby, the director, fought for John Voight, and United Artists in the end agreed. But they declared that the responsibility for any financial failure would rest entirely with Ashby, Hellman, and Jane Fonda. Actually, Jane Fonda herself had her doubts about John Voight. He was an emotional New York trained method actor, and she was a highly disciplined Hollywood person who learned her lines and stuck to the script. Uh, um, the character Grace in the comedy Grace and Frankie, who is a very strict kind of person, that actually was Jane Fonda as an actress. That's how she was. It's the real person. I know we don't think of Jane Fonda that way, but that's how she was on the set. So everybody had doubts about Voight, but he threw himself into the role. As a veteran anti-Vietnam War activist, he spent long hours talking to paraplegic veterans. He learned how to play basketball from a wheelchair. He constantly invited the paraplegic veterans to his home. At the party at the end of the movie, he stayed in his wheelchair to honor the paraplegic veterans who'd also been invited. He didn't suddenly stand up and start drinking. Even after Coming Home was finished, he kept his wheelchair at his house in case vets wanted to show up to play para basketball. Tillman says that later, when I showed UA the final print, the first thing they said was how wrong they had been about Voight, that Voight was terrific. And of course, he was later nominated for Best Actor and won at the Academy Awards in 1979. And when he won, he brought along Lou Carello, one of his paraplegic veterans' friends, as his date. Voight had already scored success in Midnight Cowboy, but in the early 70s, he had a series of failures. It was Luke Martin who made him an enduring star. He says that it was what inspired him in part artistically was Marlon Brando, who had made his great leap to stardom as the angry, embittered paraplegic veteran of World War II in Stanley Kramer's movie The Men from 1950. An angry role, and Brando's great at anger, an angry role that was the model for Voight. Then, with only a few weeks left in 1976 to complete the shooting script, Waldo Salt had a severe heart attack. He couldn't continue as screenwriter. They couldn't find another screenwriter who could finish the script. And so they were going to start production with an incomplete script. How come? Because no delay was possible. because Jane Fonda herself was contracted legally to start another film in May. It's the movie Comes a Horseman, a Western. So if they wanted Jane Fonda, they had to start shooting now, no matter what. Plus, the United Artists executives had always been nervous about the project because of its subject matter, and now they suddenly had a different Vietnam movie in their production hopper, Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. Plus, they knew that over at Universal, they were beginning production on a third Vietnam movie, Michael Cimino's The Deer Hunter. So this is all in 1977. That's when Hollywood is waking up to doing movies about Vietnam suddenly. So why should UA spend money on yet another Vietnam movie, competing with the other two, and one that had such a depressing hospital atmosphere? So a missed starting date because of an uncertain script would have given United Artists a legitimate excuse to stop the project. Uh, so they began filming. And as they began filming, Jane Fonda says, we were unsure of where each scene was going or how it would juxtapose with the next scene. We just didn't know because the script was unfinished. Ashby's key task as director turned out to be uh, keeping things in some sort of order despite all the chaos. One of the things he did was to jettison much of the existing script's rhetoric. Quote, what attracted me to the material was that if you showed 50 men in wheelchairs, you didn't have to say a lot of words about it. In the script, the Marine captain was unsympathetic and super macho, while Luke was almost too angelic. But this aspect of the script disappeared, and it disappeared because they extemporized in rehearsal in front of Ashby and transformed their characters into more complex figures. The actors did this extemporaneously. They rewrote the script as they went. Ashby would have the actors improvise scenes on the weekends at his house in Malibu, and those improvised scenes would become the script. That was how the three-way confrontation between Sally, Luke, and Bob was made. Ashby had them improvise over one weekend at his house what would happen in such a confrontation, what each character would say. And then out of that came the script. Luckily for everyone, Ashby was a director who was comfortable with chaos. Uh, Here's some examples of this on the spot filmmaking. Bruce Dern, who took the role of the Marine captain after Jon Voight vacated it to play Luke, insisted that the character be given more a three-dimensional look. Ashby, who is more a hippie than a New Left type, agreed to make him more human. So did Jane Fonda. So did Dern and Ashby and Fonda, and not the script created and improvised the character we see on the screen. Uh, the example in the script is that as the script was written by Waldo Salt, the ending was that Bob Hyde, the Marine captain, would take his rifle and go onto an overpass on the freeway and start shooting people on the freeway until he himself was killed. Great visual, but they X'd it out. They said they weren't going to do that. Or again, the content in Jon Voight's ending speech at his old high school was almost totally an improvisation, supported by a rehearsal that itself was scriptless. Ashby knew how deep Voight was in his character and just said to him, say what Luke would say. And that was what was filmed. Then, as to the almost to the end of principal photography, they had no ending. They knew what they didn't want, which was that the Marine captain goes crazy and starts shooting people on the freeway, but they didn't know how to uh, deal with it. The Marine captain, by everyone was agreed that Marine Bob Hyde couldn't go out as a killer. Nevertheless, he had to go because the Jane Fonda character had to be free of him. So they decided that he would commit suicide at the end. But then, how would he do it? Would he shoot himself? What? The answer came from Hal Ashby's own life. In 1968, Ashby had contemplated committing suicide by swimming out into the Pacific Ocean. And that was what was filmed. Uh, Bruce Dern's version of Hal Ashby's thinking about committing suicide. Now, the first question directed to returning disabled soldiers by their wives, by their girlfriends, even by their buddies, centered invariably on their sexual capacity. How was this going to be handled in the film? Early in the planning, the filmmakers knew they had to confront this. They discussed it with Dr. Joshua Golden, director of the Sexual Dysfunction Clinic at UCLA, and his wife Peggy. And they supplied them with information regarding the sexual abilities of the disabled, as well as providing access to many patients and therapists to talk to them about what to do. John Voight, however, received a more colorful education in these matters because of his close association with the paraplegic veterans. He says, quote, 500 guys were telling me how they did it. Every time I turned around, somebody would say, you know what I do? Or you want to make it really terrific? Jane Fonda was very reluctant to play the love scene nude. Fearful audiences would see not the character Sally, but rather Jane Fonda up there naked on the screen. Ashby says, I told her we would make it seem like the character, not her. The people who would say, I always knew what Jane Fonda was like, you can do nothing about them anyway. Just feel good about the scene. It was Jane Fonda who also resisted Ashby's idea that Luke still retained use of his penis for penetration. She felt that was avoiding the real issue that most paraplegic men faced, and that issue had to be faced. It was Fonda who insisted that the successful sex between Sally and Luke be oral sex. Again, I don't mean to praise Jane Fonda too much, but she's a courageous person. She's a courageous person to tackle old age in Frankie and Grace, and she was a courageous person here. So the set was cleared of all but the cameraman Haskell Wexler and the director Hal Ashby. There was a body double, as Jim Green suspected, a stand-in with similar skin tones, and she was used in a few shots as a courtesy to Fonda. We wanted to emphasize the romance, says Haskell Wexler, not the corporal aspects. The result was certainly encouraging to paraplegics such as Ron Kovic when they saw the film. This was a serious contribution to people's lives. John Voight says, the war separated us all, but these guys experienced another kind of separation from their injury, separation caused by their injury, separation from their body. Their isolation is extreme. Attention must be paid to these people. Um, Coming home went smoothly in filming. Was done by April 1977, so Jane Fonda could go off to her new project in May. That was followed by 8 months of editing, and there developed a major problem even at the editing stage. His regular editor came to Ashby and told him he didn't understand the material, that it was a jumble, that he didn't see how it could be cut together to make a reasonable narrative. So Ashby took a risk and promoted Donnie Zimmerman, who had experience as an assistant editor on previous Hal Ashby films, but had never been chief cutter on any film before. But Zimmerman was himself a Vietnam veteran and understood what Ashby wanted. Zimmerman would later be nominated for an Academy Award in editing for Coming Home. He went on to be the chief editor of Heaven Can Wait, 1978, Being There, 1979, and 30 other Hollywood films. So that was a risk that paid off. Ashby insisted on using, as I've said, a score of late 60s pop music as though an FM underground radio station was switched on throughout the movie. As we said, in this he was following the path pioneered by Dennis Hopper's soundtrack for Easy Rider. To begin with Bruce Dern as the Marine captain jogging along to the Rolling Stones' Baby, You're Out of Time, that was a brilliant decision. By the way, Bruce Dern was a marathon runner. So what you see when you see him running, he's really running. He was a big runner all his life. In fact, the dark songs of the Stones dominate the soundtrack and express the darkening vision of 1968. Another very powerful example, at least for me, was Ashby's choice of the slow, sad song Expecting to Fly by Buffalo Springfield during the lovemaking scene of Luke and Sally. How much lesser this scene would be, it seems to me, without the mournful voice of Neil Young singing in the background. Some executives wanted an original score, so Ashby had to fight with them about that. Ashby felt that the music played such a very important part during the period of the movie that it was that music that had to be used. Also, he said he was concerned that with a picture with such strong emotions, a conventional score manipulating the audience's emotions more and more would make it a real soap opera. It's pretty soap opera anyway. And now we come to the distribution crisis. You thought all the problems were over. No. United Artists bureaucrats had never been very enthusiastic about Coming Home, especially when Fonda and Ashby rejected the demand for a top-ranked male star to play Luke. But then, in late 1977, as Coming Home was being readied for distribution, Orion Films launched a successful hostile takeover of United Artists. The result was a new group of top executives who would decide the fate of Coming Home. And however lukewarm the United Artists had been about Coming Home, nobody at Orion Films wanted any United Artists project, such as Coming Home, to succeed. They were jealous. How they handled this was planning a minimal distribution of the film. In New York City, that meant an opening at one single, grungy, third-rate theater. You know, we saw the same kind of intended destruction of a disliked product by use of minimal distribution with Easy Rider. And a financially failed film would have damaged the careers of everyone connected to it. Well, Ashby and the producer Jerome Hellman fought back hard, but most important was that Jane Fonda had had a huge success in the summer of 1977 with the suburban bank robbing comedy Fun with Dick and Jane. That had been a huge success, made a huge amount of money, tripled the investment by the studio, and she was suddenly not a person to be dissed. Without Fun with Dick and Jane, Coming Home would have not been distributed. And so the single cinema in New York City became a first rank one. And then the crowd paying to see it went around the block. The distributors accepted that actually they were sitting on a gold mine. In conjunction with the premiere, Hellman, the producer, showed the film to the patients at Rancho Los Amigos Spinal Center. He says, their reaction was marvelous. The recurrent theme of disabled people who've seen this movie is that it's the first time that someone suffering from a horrible disability had been dealt with in films as a whole human being, with a complete repertory of feelings, emotions, visceral, and sexual needs. So at the Academy Awards in April 1979, Jane Fonda won the Oscar for Best Actress, Jon Voight won the Oscar for Best Actor, and the writers of the non-existent screenplay won the Oscar for Best Screenplay. That's how Hollywood also works. Coming Home was nominated for Best Picture, but was defeated by another even grimmer Vietnam film, The Deer Hunter, directed by Michael Cimino. Like Coming Home, The Deer Hunter was a hit at the box office. And what that shows was that by 1978, 1979, Americans were finally willing to see films about Vietnam. Okay, so let's take a break and then we'll be back in 5 minutes for a discussion. And if people have detailed questions, they can certainly put them on chat. Beverly says correctly that Jon Voight, who played Luke Martin, is now politically an ultra conservative. He is. He's a supporter of Donald Trump. Hard to know what to make of that. And says he regrets his past liberal positions. And Susan Hansey says, not related to the film, Dick and I are both reading Art's wife's book, Yippee Girl. It's an immersive look at the era we've been discussing, including Black Panthers and Venus women's liberation movement. The book is fascinating, and we both recommend it. Okay. One of the things that happened that Judy discusses is that she and a group of people, including Ann Wiles and Jane Shear, were part of the first women's consciousness raising circle in Berkeley. And that on May 15th, 1969, they had planned to have a women's liberation march from Cal down Telegraph. But that night, the night before, is when the university seized People's Park and put a fence around it. And she says, well, we decided that something else was more important, namely the fight for the park. And she said, but in that period, women were always being told that something else was more important than their issues. Mm-hmm. And but she did. She went along with it and did that. I do want to say something I've already told a bunch of people. Uh, um, because Judy was very close to Tom Hayden, and Tom Hayden married Jane Fonda. Judy also got to know Jane Fonda a little bit, and Judy and I both know Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden's son, Troy Garrity, who's a Hollywood figure. And there are two things about Jane Fonda in connection with this, because uh, Judy knew Jane Fonda. She and her husband, Stu Albert, visited Jane and Tom at their Malibu mansion, and we have a photograph of Jane with Judy's toddler daughter, Jessica, and Jane is dressed in a full Easter Bunny suit, holding Jessica's hand. There's the threat to national security.
Yeah.
The, the other thing is when Tom died, there was a memorial for him. And Troy Garrity, Tom and Jane Fonda's son, spoke at that memorial and encomium about what a good father he had been. And Jane Fonda was there was a chat because a lot of it was Zoom. There was a chat, and Jane Fonda was on the chat. And after Troy got through praising Tom, a message appeared from Jane. It said, "Oh, Troy, I'm so proud of you, dash, mom." I think it's hard for us to think of Jane Fonda as mom, but I guess Mark said, or before we began, there's the public persona that people have, and then there's the real person, the private person, who is an actor doing other people or aspects of themselves only, and then there's mom. So I think it's important to think about this, that the people who make these films really are real people with their own private lives, and in this case, a good one.
Art, you've got a few more chats, I think, and I think Mark Gordon has his hand up.
Okay, let's go. Mark.
Well, you don't want to deal with those nice chats first? I could wait.
Oh. Well, Lou, I guess, writes this is it's no wonder that the film was such an impactful success, and that your lecture today does likewise. It's rare that people involved in making a film and lecturing about it have deep personal. Oh, that's just praise of me. Never mind.
Yeah.
But I think because of these kind of accidental and limited connections that Judy and I had with Jane Fonda, and I think also actually because of Grace and Frankie, taking on old age as she does and being forgetful as she does in that show, shows that she was a really fully rounded, admirable person. Of course, she's also a billionaire with her damned exercise tapes. Another thing, who knew that was going to happen? And she's now actually a leader in anti-Trump politics also. So she hasn't given up. She may be a billionaire, but she hasn't given up that aspect of it. And it's kind of interesting. I think in the late 60s, people might have thought that Peter Fonda was going to be the really dominant one among the brother-sister combination, but she's really the one who's the giant among the two of them.
Yeah.
And later in 1980, she made a movie called On Golden Pond, which is about the reconciliation of children who have been alienated by especially the father, with the father as he's dying. And it's her and Henry Fonda in that movie. It's quite an amazing movie in itself.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. Who else wants to?
I had something I wanted to.
Hey, hold on. Before you go, Mark, I have a question in the chat. So,
Oh yeah, go ahead.
All
Go
your
for
horses. Yeah. So, Art, you didn't mention why the title. Who came up with the title?
Oh,
Coming home. I mean, coming home basically refers as a meaning, as a place to come and be yourself and relax, be in a comfortable environment. This is obviously not the case for this movie.
I think the title is intended in part ironic and tragic. Luke comes home and he's a paraplegic. Bob comes home and he's post-traumatic stress disorder. He's told that his wife is cheating on him, and he eventually commits suicide. So the coming home has to do with the terrible things that were happening in 1968, I think. And
Yeah, and by default, home being America,
yes,
the terrible things that were happening vis-a-vis the Vietnam War. Oh, I see. I got it.
and Antonin Gutman writes, you mentioned Hollywood not making movies about Vietnam. I was wounded in Vietnam in 1968. Later, I felt a lot of resentment because it seemed that people were pretending that Vietnam had never happened. I think that's right. That's what was going on. That was,
Wow.
and you know, they said the Hollywood people, the Hollywood executives are investors. They're saying nobody wants to see a movie about Vietnam. Nobody's ready to see a movie about Vietnam. Unlike World War II, the good war, where the war movies were just pouring out. Although even there, in a movie like Battleground from 1949, which is about the Battle of the Bulge, in which the soldiers are presented as scared, freezing, no food, uh, fighting desperately just to stay alive. The Army was very upset about that movie, even though it was based on memoirs of people in the 101st Airborne Division. And so even there, you could see kind of that kind of reaction against it. But the way that Vietnam was handled was nobody would touch it as an investment.
Art, Richard has his hand up.
Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, the premise of the movie with the wife who finds that she can grow once her husband's out of the house by becoming independent, by buying a car, by renting a house, doing things that she never had an opportunity to do. That's an extremely common scenario in the military format.
Tell us more.
Say what?
Tell us more.
Okay. Well, I was spent a lot of time with POW wives who had the additional problem that they didn't know if their husband was alive or dead
Yeah.
for 5 or 6 or 7 years.
Hmm.
And there was a real problem of how to live their life. The power of attorney that their husband left them with, turns out they're not valid if the person is dead. So
Yeah, sure.
power of attorney wasn't valid. They couldn't go and get money out of the bank or buy a car or do anything.
Hmm.
So
Wow.
the problem of the wife of a military member was well portrayed by Jane Fonda, I thought.
I'm that's fascinating to know and pretty horrifying also, right? The legal problem is horrifying. How did wives survive?
Yeah, the wives had to resort to things like getting one of his husband's squadron mates to go down and pretend to be the husband.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
Have you ever thought of writing a movie script about that?
No, but there's one in there someplace, let me tell
There
you.
is.
The women themselves, I had one tell me that she had a recurring nightmare of driving around in her station wagon. She had a coffin in the back.
Oh,
She didn't know if there's anything in it or not.
wow.
And if
Um,
the remember the winning photograph of Air Force guy coming home and his family rushing up to meet him.
yeah, sure. Right, right.
So what about it?
uh, when he got off the plane in the Philippines to be medically examined, there was a letter waiting for him that his wife had given the chaplain saying that she was going to divorce him
Yeah.
when he got home. So that
Uh,
photograph does not depict what the reality of the soldier's life was like.
wow.
While he was gone, she was dating a variety of other men, had 3 other proposals of marriage, had spent a good bit of the money that he was supposedly saving. So that was one wife who didn't particularly wait around for him to come back. But the wives themselves were absolutely reluctant to comment on how any wife conducted her life under the terrible circumstances of being a POW wife.
Mm,
In the movie Best Years of Our Lives from 1946, there's a coming home uh, situation where somebody who lost both his hands and has only metal hooks for hands arrives home to see his wife who's been waiting for him, and she's uh, horrified.
Maybe Mark's turn now.
Mark.
so this whole course has been about counterculture and film and how, and to me, it's sort of been a deep reflection on what was really happening in the country. And it feels like this film touches a lot of that because while the counterculture was pretty much not very active in 1979 or 78, by then, the ability of Jane Fonda's character, of Sally, to emerge as a pretty clear and powerful person, and her buddy, her roommate, what's her name? I can't, Vi. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, that was definitely like a much freer version. I think that coming home particularly is poignant, maybe more poignant for people in 78 who had memories of World War II, where coming home was by and large considered you were victorious over a vicious dictator, and you were a hero. And the whole idea of patriotism, the question of what does it mean to be patriotic, is challenged by the experience of Vietnam, I think, and it's implied in this film in a big way, I think, and I think we still are living with that to some extent.
yeah. I've got 2 comments about that. One is that my father was with the 5th Marine Division on Iwo Jima, so the 26th Marine Regiment. He never recovered from that experience. Half of his unit were killed.
Oh, goodness.
And he couldn't stand loud noises. He worked at night in the post office as a mail sorter because sorting mail was a way of restoring order
Uh-huh.
that he felt. It was he never recovered from it. And the other thing is, I guess I was about between 2005 and 2015. I did some work for the National War College in D.C., and I met a lot of officers. And of course, they're the cream, but they were all very much concerned that what happened in Vietnam in terms of the division between the armed forces and the populace should never happen again.
Mm.
They were very concerned that there not be that division, that in the post-Vietnam period, uh, there had been a connection reestablished between the armed forces and the populace, in part because the armed forces really were integrated racially. And it was a big success story, which of course Trump is now trying to destroy. But there was a very big success story, and people understood that. And the other thing to say is I was with these guys. They were colonels and naval captains who were certainly headed for flag rank and general rank. Uh, in 2003, or winter of 2002, 2003. And they did not want to go to Iraq because they knew that what was going to happen in Iraq was going to happen in Iraq. And when you have, as I did, a Marine captain like Bob Hyde saying, absolutely, this is a terrible idea. I go, my God, what is going on in the country that they're going ahead? You know, it's one thing to do Vietnam. It's another thing, having experienced Vietnam, to do it again.
Mhm.
You know, that is where these folks were. So that's my reaction to it. Coming home was always a problem. Coming home was always a problem, I guess, in this after the Civil War too. But it's a huge, but very few films. The Best Years of Our Lives is one. The Men is another one. That was, and that one's by Stanley Kramer. And by the way, if we do another course and it's on films of the Cold War, we're going to start with On the Beach, with Stanley Kramer movie. If we do that, but I just want to say that very few movies are able to confront these issues because they're bad investments. The fear is they are bad investments, that people won't go see these movies. And that's true, even though the fact was they did. I mean, both Best Years of Our Lives was a huge hit. The Men made Marlon Brando's career. Uh, Coming Home and The Deer Hunter and Apocalypse Now were all except really big hits, but there was still reluctance to touch it, as Antonin says. There was big reluctance to touch it. The bad investment. That's how people viewed it. But the result was, as you were saying, Antonin, to create a false memory of it never having happened. Yeah. Uh, yeah. The Germans were better with the Nazis than we were with Vietnam. But then it all changes.
Wow.
It changes given 10 years perspective.
Yeah.
Somebody, so Shelley,
Yeah.
right? Okay, wait, I've got stuff on chat and also uh, people raising their hands. Yes?
No, that was just a comment from me that you have a
Yeah.
chat.
Okay. Art, Shelley asked, you haven't mentioned the cancellation of the draft after Vietnam War. In my opinion or impression, that has a huge impact on the relationship between the people and the army. Please comment. Yeah, I had a low draft number in the draft lottery. I got out of the draft by being a conscientious objector.
Mhm.
And compared to that uh, draft uh, board examination, my PhD orals were nothing. That doesn't mean I'm not patriotic, as Holly knows. So, but this was uh, really scary. Uh, and I think certainly the cancellation of the draft created a situation where the people who are in the army really want to be in the army. But it's a complicated story there also. I had a really brilliant undergraduate student, and she came from Northwest Maryland, which is a pretty poverty-stricken area. And she and her high school boyfriend got married, but he didn't have a job. And so they decided the best thing would be for him to join the army, volunteered for the army. And he got sent to Iraq. And he got blown up in Iraq, but not killed, unfortunately, just losing 80% of his mind. And she had to drop out of school. She should have gone to graduate school. She's a brilliant kid. Because somebody had to work to take care of him. They weren't getting enough money from the government to be able to do it. So her entire life was wrecked, and I'm sure that happened to many people in every war.
You know, Art, I remember I was in the second year of the draft.
Yeah.
And they had changed it a little bit from the first year, but I was working outside in a roustabout kind of a job, so I couldn't listen to it live, which they had it on the radio. But my father called me when I got back, and he said to me, son, I have your draft number. And I believe he probably said 259, but what I heard was 259. And that pause in my brain, which was racing between the 2 and the 50, I'll never forget that feeling, you know, because it was a very frightening and nervous moment for all of us. You know, what number are we going to get? You know, it was a very nervous time, obviously.
But wait, I'm confused. Was it 259?
It was 259. But I heard, what my brains heard was 259, because that gap, although it was very short, my brain just pushed it out. And it was really, you know, so you have that moment of, oh, that's not good.
Well, let's see. Holly Carey says, my boyfriend at the time drew #1 in the draft. Then he flunked out of college, and away he went. What happened to him, Holly? You got to unmute. There she is.
I don't know what happened. He shipped out to Fort Hood, and I didn't hear anymore.
Wow.
So I don't think it was a good ending.
No.
More chats available now.
Yeah. Well, Shelley says it means we have mercenaries and people who are desperate, like I was talking about with the husband of my student. It means we have fewer middle class and politically more powerful people. You know, if you look at the University of Cambridge in Britain, there's a gateway memorializing those Cambridge graduates and undergraduates who died in World War I. And it's an enormous list, just an enormous list. But how many people who went to Harvard actually served in Vietnam? It's a very small list. And there were always fewer middle class and politically more powerful people serving in the army. Just ask Trump with his bone spurs. I think that was always a problem. Although I think, again, the armed forces officers that I met who were at the War College, so they were all top flight people, they were very impressive people to me. I don't think, and I'm sure that they were middle class, but you know, the Creedence Clearwater song "Fortunate Son," you know that? People are always saying, go off to war. We say, how much can we give? The answer is always more, more, more. But I ain't no fortunate son. I ain't no senator's son. So how many senators' sons served in Vietnam? I think the situation is actually going to change, is changing. It changed in 2024 somewhat. It's going to change more in 2026 and 28 when you get veterans coming into Congress again in pretty large numbers. That's already happening.
And what's going to change?
Um,
You
here's,
said it's going to change, but what? What do you think is going to change?
I'm guessing. Okay, I think that part of the problem right now is there's no profiles in courage going on. It's something I don't understand. The actual Republican control in the House is only 4 or 5 seats. Could easily, it's an accident in some ways. It could easily change if you have 3 people who change their votes, but they won't because they're afraid of being primaried in 26. Where's the profiles in courage? These people are mostly millionaires. Why can't they say, okay, I'll make my stand, and if I lose, I'll go off to my ranch in Montana? I think that the army people that are going in, from my impression of them, from what I saw, which was, again, the cream, those are not people who will do that. They're people who will stand up for principle. But Shelley, I could be wrong.
I mean, I think it was Charlie Rangel who said we need to get back the draft. That was a long time ago. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's not necessarily that so many middle-class people did it. Lots of people did have, but you were scared of it. They were scared of it. It was present in a way that is not the case when you have a bunch of mercenaries. And I think that's why we can go off and send money and troops and so forth without having any consensus. You don't have to convince the people of anything. So, I mean, I feel ambivalent because obviously I was against people going to do this, but the point is that it means you can just dismiss it, and there's a tremendous separation between what policy can be, and you don't have to convince the American people to send people away. So,
Yeah, I think
that's what I
that's a real political issue. And so what's going to happen when it's all robots? They're already introducing robots.
already, yeah, and drones and so forth.
Then
But
you can say, what the hell, right? And at least certainly what the tragedy in Vietnam was that because of the draft, it depended on real public support in order to maintain the war.
yeah.
And that and that turned out not to be there for very good reasons, right?
And as for I mean, the problem is like in World War I, of course, it was an absolute disaster. And by the way, there's a wonderful book called The Great War and Modern Memory.
Mm-hmm.
A wonderful, wonderful book.
Paul Fussell.
Yeah, and you don't want to have all of these middle-class educated people killed in the thing either, So I don't know, but I do think that this tremendous separation between the populace and convincing them of things and having the commander in chief be able to do anything he wants is
But
not,
Paul Fussell himself
not
was
a good thing.
Paul Fussell himself was a World War II veteran and wrote a kind of memoir of his experiences in the victorious fight against awful fascism and Nazism. But he had a terrible time. He shouldn't have been drafted in the first place. He had bad feet, but he ended up in the infantry because that's what they needed, bodies. So all of this shows that war, I mean, I think Shelley's point is you can now have wars where the impact on society is much less. I think that's right.
Of what's going on.
Yeah, I had high school friends who died in Vietnam. So, but that's because they were drafted. So the draft was, I think I'd support the draft for national service. I think that wouldn't hurt people. Yeah.
Art, but we're almost out of time, and I want to say how much I appreciate your tremendous support for Jane Fonda and what she has meant. You know, all of us have, with our gray hair, have lived through a lot of, I mean, I went to Cal, so I was there in the 60s. But I was told by my guidance counselor in high school, I had 3 really good options. I could be a nurse, I could be a secretary, or I could be an elementary school teacher.
Right.
Jane Fonda and people like her represent a huge shift in my lifetime. And thank you for pointing that out to everybody here.
Oh, good.
Yes,
Good.
Well said.
Yeah,
I
that's
agree.
great. We'll tell Troy that people don't change.
Tell him, yes.
That's great. That's great.
Or maybe that's a good place to stop.
Let's stop. Yep.
And thank you very much for 6
so
great
much.
episodes. My goodness.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
That's great. Oh, thanks.
And please come back for films
Yeah.
of the Cold War.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Art.
Or
Art,
anything else.
we'll be in touch with you about the next lecture series.
Great.
We know where you live.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Art. We'll see you. Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.